Well, hello everybody. Are we ready to start, Evelyn?
Oh yeah, we are.
Good. Well, we're happy to be back um, talking to everyone. And just a reminder, as we've said many times before, please send us questions and reactions to our program, and also ideas for future programs. A couple of programs we're thinking of doing in the next time in the near future are depression, a program on depression next time. And then after that, a program on the criminal mind and how criminals think that are different from the ways normal people think. So those are a couple of ideas that we have, but we'd really like to hear your ideas and suggestions for uh, future programs.
Hello. Hi. So today's topic is what therapists do, and that's what we want to discuss about. Um, my name is Evelyn Njeri, and I'm a mental health practitioner. And it's good to see you once again. This is a new week, brand new week of our show Mind to Mind, and I'm joined by my friend Dr. Claiborn.
Hi, I'm a psychologist here in the United States, and I've worked for many years with couples and families and individuals, as well as also working with police departments and doing evaluations for the courts and attorneys. So it's a variety of things. But I've been a therapist for 53 years now. So sometimes I think I should know something by now. Um, anyway, I really enjoy working with people. And so today's topic is going to be what is therapy and what to expect, how to pick a therapist, and what your responsibility is as the client if you're a part of therapy. So we'll talk about all those things. And I was wondering if Evelyn would talk a little bit about what mental health availability and resources are like in Kenya, both in cities but also in smaller towns, and give us an overview of what resources are available.
We have a national hospital here in Nairobi called Madari Hospital. It provides uh, all psychological and say mental health, uh, like they cater for mental health issues. Both they have psychologists, psychiatrists, and therapists. And I don't know, like for some weird reason, like growing up, there used to be a stigma associated with that hospital where if you said you are going to Matari Hospital, like it's just deemed like you're crazy or something. But I think people are beginning to have a positive mindset towards what um, what mental health is, what are mental health illnesses, and why you need to seek help when you are going through some of these issues. And okay, in smaller towns, we have government hospitals where there is a department where there is psychology, and you'll find like maybe there is one psychiatrist and maybe like a head of department and a few therapists and mostly counselors. But in you find like in villages and all that, a lot of people do not seek these services, and they rely on religious leaders to maybe like to counsel them in case they're going through issues, maybe in their families with
Uh-huh.
their children and all that.
Uh-huh.
And you find that there's a tricky bit about that because like if there are some religious facilities where a religious leader is supposed to go through psychology in their training so that they can be able to handle such issues if they do come to them. But now you find like some of the religious institutions do not go through any kind of training, and they use people. They might end up using people's issues against them, or like to uh, what is it called? To try and uh, I'm looking for the word, like when someone is trying to manipulate you, using your problems and showing you like maybe you need to do a certain thing so that like God can, help you with your problem. It's more of a manipulative tactic. And I don't know whether you have kept up to date with some of the issues going on in Kenya. And a few months ago, it was discovered that a certain religious leader in the coastal region of Kenya had been manipulating people to stop eating and starve themselves to death. And a lot of over 100 bodies were discovered where they used to bury people. They used to kidnap people and force them not to eat, and then end up burying them in a whole a site called Shakahola. Right now, Shakahola is such a raw memory in Kenyans' ears because of that. So it is important for people to understand what to expect during therapy, and what you will be seeking during therapy, the importance of seeking professional help, and also how to identify whether, like, some of the religious leaders have right. Well, you go for them when you go to them for help and all that. So it is important for people to understand um,
I think
the
that's
importance of
what you're
what
mentioning is really
the
good because
counselors.
even if you seek help from a professional counselor or a trained psychologist, it's very important to feel comfortable with that person. If you feel like that person isn't really understanding you or isn't really listening or is manipulating you into accepting some ideas that are not comfortable, then it's all right to quit and to find another person. Um, there's no reason. It is a team effort when you're in going to see a therapist. The therapist helps, but the client, the person, also has their important role to play, and it's a team effort. And if you don't feel comfortable, you don't really feel that that person understands you. It really is all right to leave and find someone else. That's I
Yeah,
always tell people that it's all right to pick somebody else and try to find somebody that's you're more comfortable with.
yeah. And also, like, there should be some sort of realistic expectation, like from like the person you are seeking help from should have some sort of realistic explanation. I don't know, like,
Hmm.
for
Yeah, one of
example,
the things.
looking at sorry, for example, looking at the story I just told you about Shakahola, like when someone tells you that you need to starve yourself so that you can seek some sort of redemption from a savior, it doesn't sound normal, and I think it's important for people to do research before um, seeking help from people, to know what exactly to expect from the person you're seeking help from.
Right. And one really good way of finding somebody to have as a therapist is word of mouth from other
Mm.
people who have had similar experiences with that person, or they know somebody that they know is good because they've worked with them before. So just like finding a lot of other professionals, word of mouth is very helpful to find somebody
Yeah,
that is going to be good.
yeah,
Maybe we should talk about what to expect.
yeah.
Let me
I think that's
mention a couple of things, and Evelyn, you can add in too. I mean, one of the first things to expect, and I'm assuming this is true in Kenya also, is that whatever takes place between you and the therapist will be confidential. and that it will be private and will not be shared with anyone. Um, the only exception in our country is if you use health insurance, then the fact that you've seen that therapist or you've had therapy, or that fact will be available to others if you apply for life insurance or other kinds of things later. Just the fact that you've seen a therapist might be available. But the content of what you talk about with the therapist should be completely confidential and totally private.
Yeah, yeah. I think like one of the reasons as to why, like, let's say most Africans like are so afraid and they have a negative attitude towards therapies because like most of the things that when you go to a therapist, one of the most important things is to be honest within yourself and to completely express yourself based on how you're feeling, especially, and that would mean discussing about your family members and all that. So just the thought of like maybe your child or your mom or someone like going to a total stranger and discussing like intimate details about your family, that's maybe one of the most scary things to ask, because you're like, if they're not family, why should they know what we're going through? Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things you can do in your very first meeting with a therapist is share some of your personal thoughts and feelings and see how that person reacts. And if they
Yeah.
are understanding and accepting and they're interested and they are curious and they're not judgmental, then you can express more private things. So you don't have to express everything that are your private, intimate feelings from the very beginning. You can do it bit by bit and test whether that therapist is interested and understanding and accepting of what you're saying. And if they are, then you can go further. But definitely, you should expect the therapist to keep the content of your sessions confidential.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
Another thing you should look for when you're first meeting with that therapist, I think, is, are they a good listener? Do they really listen to what you're saying, and do they really try to understand what you're expressing and not make assumptions about that they know what's good for you or that what you're trying to say? They really need to be a good listener at first, and you can tell that from the first session, I think.
Yeah, they should try and understand, like learning your dictionary. You as a client, like they need to understand like who am I? Like let's say I'm the client and Dr. Claiborn is the therapist. Like he needs to understand like what's my story? How do I view the world? How do I view situations and all that? So it's
And
really,
and when you
yeah.
use certain words, like let's say you use the word depression or anxiety or certain terms, then it's my job not to believe that I already know what you mean, but to ask you more questions to find out what you yourself particularly really mean by those words. It may be something different than what I think. And so, yes, we call that learning the other person's dictionary, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, depression is a good example because if somebody says they're depressed, it could mean they're sad or angry or frustrated or confused or helpless or desperate, or I mean,
Yeah.
many things. And so that's my favorite example because it can mean so many different things. And so the therapist has to ask, well, tell me more. What do you mean when you use the term depression? What does that mean to you? And and some of that is cultural too. The therapist may come from a different cultural background than
Mm.
the client or the person, and so there is a lot of educating then the person needs to do to make sure the therapist understands their culture and the background they come from.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, it really is a team effort. The research shows, in our country anyway, that the client, the person coming for therapy, their motivation and their uh, commitment to getting better is much more important than any of the qualities the therapist has. So the therapist's experience and training and the therapist qualities are important, but not as important as the motivation and the commitment of the client, the customer. And so but both work together. So it really is a team effort. And as Evelyn mentioned, it's the customer has to be honest, but also the therapist has to be honest and truthful and to
Mhm.
say what he or she really thinks about something. One of the first things people want to know when they go for therapy is whatever they're experiencing in their life, is it normal? Is it somewhere in the normal range? And then what to do about it, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or is it something that's really not normal? And so a lot of people, they don't necessarily ask that in words, but one of the things they really want to know is what they're experiencing normal. Just like when we go to the doctor with an illness and we tell the doctor what the illness is and what it feels like, and we want to partly know, have they ever seen this before? Is this normal? Is this something that's understandable, and or is this something really unusual? And we all want to
Yeah.
know that, but we may not remember to ask that.
Mhm. I think I have a question. How do you ask a therapist, like, or let's say your counselor, like what their qualifications are without making them feel uncomfortable? I don't know,
Well,
like without
you, yeah, you just
forcing.
ask them, and it
Yes,
should not make them feel uncomfortable. If you ask a therapist what their training and qualifications are, and it makes them uncomfortable, go see someone else. Because really, that's a very normal question. As a good consumer and a customer, you should ask that question. Where did they go to school, and how much training do they have, and have they ever worked with a problem like yours before? Uh, some people come to therapy for individual problems, but some people come for family or
Yeah.
relationship problems. And so you might want to ask the therapist, have you ever worked with couples before? Have you ever worked with families before? Oh, those are good questions, Evelyn.
Yeah. I think it's really important for you to be comfortable with who you're choosing to do your counseling or therapy, because if you don't understand what their qualifications are and you have questions about it and you're not asking that, it means you will not get the best out of it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And it's also a test of how open the therapist is going to be. If you ask that question and they just right away give you all the information very willingly, that's a good sign. That
Yeah,
means
it
that
is.
they're going to be open with you. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, Evelyn. Um, that's really good with going to any professional, whether it's a
Mhm.
doctor or an accountant or anybody. You want to know what their background is.
Yeah.
I think that's a
There are
really
people when, like, for example, if you went to hospital and let's say you have been trying to get information about maybe an issue you're dealing with, and none of the people you're seeking help from is giving you like a proper answer, or they seem like they're confused, or they're sending you to a million and one tests. So when you ask them what their qualifications are, they seem to be a little bit in, I don't know, they get offended.
Mhm. I think that may be more common with medical professionals than it is with therapists because therapists really shouldn't be offended, partly because there are lots of different kinds of therapists. And so it's normal for the client to ask, what type are you? What's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Or what is your approach to working with depression? Those are normal, really good questions. I really encourage you to ask those questions. Evelyn, you were going to talk a little bit about
Okay.
types of people that seek therapy. I mean, what kinds of problems are good to take to a therapist?
Yeah. Speaking of which, I needed you to explain to us like the difference between a psychotherapist, a psychologist, and a counselor.
Well, in our country, and I'm not sure about in Kenya, a psychiatrist would be somebody who has graduated from medical school and primarily uses medications to treat mental disorders. A psychologist is usually a doctoral level, Ph.D. educated person in psychology who doesn't give medication but uses therapy techniques. Counselors are usually people that have master's degrees in social work or counseling or psychology, and they do treat mental disorders, but they don't give medication either. And then there are some specialists like addiction specialists, or trying to think of some other people who specialize in one particular kind of problem, like alcoholism or drug addiction. And they usually have bachelor's degrees or sometimes master's degrees, but their training is much more narrow, focused on the particular problem issue. So, yes, it's good to ask people what their background is. And if you're working with one of the counselors or psychologists that doesn't prescribe medication, but you think, and the therapist thinks that medication would be helpful, that counselor or psychologist can refer you to a psychiatrist or another medical doctor in addition to the therapy so that you can get both. The research shows that for lots of disorders like depression, a combination of therapy and medication is the best. Either one by itself isn't as good as both together. And so counselors and psychologists can't really prescribe medication in our country. So usually we work in combination with a medical doctor.
Mm, wow, that's really important. I think
Uh-huh.
it's really important for people to understand the difference so that you can know who you need to seek, especially if you've been going through therapy and you feel like you need now to deal with you need something like additional help like medication, and it's important to ask the person you've seen if they can
Mhm.
refer you to a psychiatrist. Yeah.
Another good question is you may not, whatever it is that is troubling you, you may not know if that's appropriate for therapy, if the therapist can help with that particular problem. And so you can just ask when you meet with a therapist the first time, you can say, here's the general thing that I want to talk to you about. Is this something therapy can help with? And then the therapist would say, I don't really think therapy is appropriate for that. Or, yes, yeah, that is something we can address. That is something therapy will help with. So that's a good question also. We don't know as just as people if what's troubling us is something that therapy can assist with or not. We don't know that. So that's another question you can ask. All
Yeah.
sorts of people go for therapy. I mean, children, there's therapy for certain childhood disorders. There are just regular adults go for individual therapy. Couples go for couples therapy. Sometimes whole
Mhm.
families go for family therapy. Um,
Mhm.
Sometimes, if it's a couple, they go together to meet with a therapist for therapy, but either one of them individually may also go to a different person for therapy just individually, so they can do both. They can have some help with their
Yeah.
relationship issues, but then they can also have individual help with certain things that they do that may be contributing to the problems in the relationship. So some people will end up doing both of those.
Yeah. I had some questions like why is it important for a therapist and does this happen oftenly like to know the background of the client?
I think it's really important because otherwise we make assumptions based on our own culture or life. Um, so one of the first things most therapists will do will be to ask the person, "Tell me a little bit about your background. Where are you from? Um, what is your family like? Have you ever had traumatic experiences, or just tell me about yourself." The very first session, usually the therapist doesn't talk very much because that's the session where the client or the consumer fills the therapist in on who they are. Plus,
Yeah.
the client is also testing to see, is that therapist listening, and are they
Mm-hmm.
really interested in me? But yes, we have to know something about the person's background, otherwise we can't really understand them.
Yeah.
No two people are identical, so no person has exactly the same background as I do.
Mm-hmm.
For example, for one thing, I might be working with a client who's female. Well,
Mm-hmm.
their experience is very different from my experience as a male, or somebody who's a different race, or comes from a different part of the country, or is a different religion. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of differences.
Yeah.
That's a
I
really
think,
good question.
yeah. I think it's really important for someone to really understand you, and it's really hard for you to like give a full description of your life and where you're from and everything within
Mhm.
a one therapy session, but
Oh yes,
giving
yes.
have an idea of who you are,
Mhm.
and every single time like maybe you present up an issue or problem, like for them to understand your perception of what that problem is and why it is a problem to you, and
Right.
before they coming in to tell you or give you other ways.
We seem to have lost Evelyn there. I think what Evelyn was saying is really right. Um, there's so many parts to understand. One question therapists often will ask early on was if, let's say, the person tells what the problem is, what it is that is troubling them, then the therapist may ask, "What have you tried to do about it already?"
Mhm.
And that helps the therapist understand more about the way the person looks at the problem. Do they see it as something they've done, or do they see it as something that they're reacting to that another person has done? Um,
Mhm.
how do they define their problem? How have they thought about it in their own mind?
Mhm.
That's a really good point. Every person is unique. What we're trained as therapists to remember is that every person we work with is a unique person, and then the general principles don't always apply to everyone. And
Yeah.
so that's why, as Evelyn is saying, the therapist trying to understand you in the beginning, and it may take several meetings for that to happen, is very crucial. And you can ask the therapist some questions about their background if you want to. Let's say
Okay.
it's religion, and you have a problem that concerns your religious beliefs, and you might say to the therapist, what's your religious background? You have, as a consumer, you have a right to know that. And
Yeah.
the therapist should be very willing to tell you what their background or their beliefs are.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I read from your article below, and I think I'd like to remind our audience, we have written a description of, like on the description down below, you'll see an article that Dr. Claiborn has written about what to expect from therapists in case there's something that we might not cover, or like just as a general outline of what we're discussing today. And one of the things that you wrote about, Dr. Claiborn, that I found very interesting, that it is important for the client to express what their expectations and goals are from that therapy session.
Mhm. I think that's really very important because, first of all, the therapist needs to know what you expect, and some of the things the person expects may not be realistic in terms of what the therapist can do. And so
Yeah,
that's important to find out in the very beginning. But also, just know the therapist knowing what the client hopes to gain from therapy tells them also about the person. And
yeah,
yes, expectations, goals. And something else that happens sometimes when the client tells me what their goals are, there may be
hmm,
another goal that I'm aware of that might help them that they haven't thought of. And I might
yeah,
say, well, how about additionally, we also work on this because I think that would fit
yeah,
with your other goals. And then the client might say, oh, good, yes. So there could be a goal or something that could be accomplished that the client hasn't even thought of yet. And so the
yeah,
therapist sometimes make a suggestion.
yeah.
Overall, though,
Uh,
the therapist should accept the goals that the client has.
yeah. I think it's also important for people to take it like a therapy at a time, like just like we say, like a day at a time, like take it at one therapy session at a time, because there are things that come up during therapy that maybe you didn't think was a problem, and or they end up being something that you need to work on, and turns out to be a goal that you need to work on. So
Mm.
like if you take it a session at a time, then you are open to finding out more about yourself and maybe some of the issues that need that may arise during those sessions that you may need to work on.
I think those first few sessions are really all about defining the extent and nature of the issues and
Yeah,
making a plan. And it sometimes is like the first phase of the therapy is the first few sessions is defining the issues and kind of making a plan. Then the second stage is actually using some techniques and working on some ideas that might
yeah,
help with that problem. And then eventually there's another stage of evaluating how are we doing?
mhm,
Are we helping? Is this helping? And which parts
yeah,
are helping? Which parts are maybe not helping? Which parts are helping? So there are stages really um, in this. One thing a therapist does, getting into that, is giving a person a different ways of looking at things. So once the
mhm,
therapist understands how the person looks at things, like let's say their marriage, and there's certain problems within the marriage, the therapist may think of some other ways of looking at those same things that may be helpful to the person that they haven't thought of. So different ways um, of viewing something. I have a dog, and you can hear my dog in the background. His
yeah,
name his name is Coconut, and he needs therapy to be able to learn to stop barking. But so
Is
far, even though I'm a
that
therapist, I haven't been able to cure him of barking. Although he is taking Prozac, which is a psychotropic medication, and it does help him be a little bit calmer. So even dogs have mental health treatment and
oh wow,
medication.
I didn't know that.
Yes, he takes a little pill of Prozac,
Mhm.
antidepressant, every morning, and it does help him be a less um, excitable. Yeah.
There is something I watched recently in a reality show, and there's this lady who's going through anxiety and depression, and she has a dog, and she was going through uh, like she was listening to I don't know if it was a meditation that was to help you out of a panic attack, something like that. And the dog started getting a panic attack. Is that normal?
I don't know that that's really normal, but anything can happen. And as a matter of fact, dogs are often used in mental hospitals as part of the therapy because dogs can be trained and to be a therapy dog, and they can be affectionate and reassuring and comforting, and so sometimes they're a part of therapy. Um, I often encourage my clients to um, get a dog or go out in nature, do things that are relaxing, that are not part of our therapy, but just generally peaceful. So
Yeah.
listening to Coco bark is
I
not
was
peaceful.
yeah, I was wondering, like, are there, I don't know, emotional, they call emotional support system dogs or something, like
Uh-huh.
animals that have emotional support system.
Yeah, people in
I
our
don't
country they use various kinds of animals to get on airplanes and travel with them, and there are some animals also that are very sensitive to physical things in their human, like when an epileptic episode is about to happen or something like
Mhm,
that. Um,
mhm.
there are some dogs that can sense that and alert their owner to something that's about to happen that the owner might not even be aware of yet. Um,
Wow.
one of the other things that happens in therapy is the more the therapist understands the client and what they're dealing with and their issues and problems, then the therapist can begin to give feedback to
Yeah.
the client in terms of how they might be trying to handle an issue. And the
Mhm.
therapist may make suggestions about different ways of trying to do something to resolve a problem. Now, the client doesn't have to accept those suggestions. Some of the suggestions might not fit, but
Yeah.
yeah, often once the therapist knows enough about the client, then part of the therapist's job is to give some different ways of looking at things and to make suggestions and to give the client feedback about
Yeah.
how their behavior might be affecting other people. And
Yeah.
that doesn't come in the first session, but that comes later once the therapist understands the person and there's a feeling of trust that's been
Mhm.
developed between the two people. Then the therapist can begin to make more um, give more direct uh, suggestions and feedback.
Yeah. I think yeah, and I think one of the other things that you discussed about was the interpretation of like one of the things that maybe a therapist does is like they give an interpretation of the client's feelings because sometimes like a client is feeling different things and maybe the expression of what that is very different from what maybe like the therapist sees it to be, and they take that opportunity to express what their interpretation of what the client is feeling.
Actually, when as the therapist asks more questions about what the person's feeling and tries to get them to really elaborate and express it, then the therapist also develops more insight into what is really going on. So,
Yes.
in a way, each one is educating the other person. The client's educating the therapist about who I am, and the therapist then educating the client about what those things are called or how to look at
Yeah.
those things and which ones are normal and which ones not, and which ones might be helpful and which ones might be counterproductive. So they're actually, in a way, teaching each other. That's part of the teamwork.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and also like showing them a new way of looking at a problem.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Some people may come with what they feel is a setback or a problem
Mhm.
or something that's unsolvable. And the therapist may eventually be able to explain that actually this thing that feels like a setback or a problem is actually an opportunity to do something
Yeah.
different, to go into make a different direction in your life. A good example of that is, let's say someone comes and they're very unhappy because their marriage is falling apart, and let's say their spouse, their partner, is drinking or using drugs or seeing another person, and so the client is really upset naturally about these things. But the more the therapist listens to it and then can explain back to the client, this person that is leaving you, it hurts a lot and you're very upset about it, but maybe there's a silver lining that that person is not good for you anyway, and that their leaving you is going eventually to be a blessing. And so there are
Mhm.
kind of different ways of looking at the same thing. Or let's say you're being fired from your job, but you didn't really like that job anyway. And
Yeah.
being fired can be an opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that it's wonderful, but it's just a
Yeah.
little different way of characterizing something that allows the person to have more ways of moving ahead in life, to go
Mhm.
forward with their own life.
Yeah. It's actually interesting because you see, like for example, like during COVID, the way some people lost their jobs and like had to restart the entire life like afresh. At first, it seemed like a huge problem where, and you don't know what is going to amount to it. But
Uh-huh.
later, like for example, like in my case, I I completely changed like my life and like the direction that I was heading to. I didn't realize how far off course I was, and even me losing my job was a blessing because I was able to like restart and
Hmm.
do what I've always wanted to do, and that's where I am right now. So
Hmm.
if that didn't happen, I would probably be somewhere so unhappy doing something I don't like doing.
Hmm. I think that's a really good example. Um, Another thing that is related to this is sometimes the client isn't sure of whatever the problem is, how much they are causing it or how much it's out of their control. So one issue sometimes we deal with is trying to together to figure out how much of this issue or this dilemma is under your control. If if a significant amount is, then maybe we can work on changing your behavior to be something different, more constructive. But sometimes people bring in a problem that really is hurting them, but they have no control over it or hardly any control over it, in which case then moving forward is going to be somehow different. It's not going to be
Mm,
something they can change. They just have to pick really a different direction.
yeah.
So yeah, what do you have control over and what you don't sometimes is a little confusing, and you can't figure it out unless you kind of explain it to another person. And then that other person can say, well, I don't think this is really your fault. I think this is the other person's fault. Um,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, even in addition to therapy, it's just good to talk with another person about your issues and your problems when you're experiencing them, because our research shows that if you have a certain problem that's bothering you and you just think about it in your own mind, you will probably not make much progress. But if you talk
Yeah.
about it to another person, it doesn't have to be an expert, but if you do talk about it to another person, the process of putting it into words allows you to wrap your mind around it and understand it in a better way than if you just thought about it internally. And so definitely picking a person you can trust, whether it's a therapist or not, and talking things out with that person is very helpful.
That happens to me a lot. I actually tend to understand an issue more when I am expressing myself maybe to someone, a
Hmm.
friend. Yeah, when I am talking to them about something, I actually get more solutions. Like when I was thinking about it myself, I didn't have solutions. Like it was
Yeah.
more of a road. But when I am talking to them, I end up getting the solutions myself while expressing
Hmm.
it to
Right.
someone else.
And I don't know whether this is this way in Kenya, but in our country, um, women are much more prone to talking things out with other friends. But men
Mm-hmm.
in our country are not. Uh, they don't tend to do that as easily. I remember a man that I worked with once that we're in the middle of a session, and he said, "Are you telling me that if I have a problem or a feeling, that it's all right for me to actually tell it to another person?" And
Wow.
I laughed and I said, "Yes, yes, I am telling you that." But in our country, I mean, men are more prone to keep things to themselves until they figure it out in their own mind. But that takes a lot longer.
But
And
I
so,
think it's all over the world. It's all over the world because even here you'll find like men will sit with their problem. They would rather come to you with solutions than
uh
with a
huh,
problem.
uh huh.
They feel like that's a woman's thing to come and talk about problems.
Uh-huh. I think there is that. And the other thing we find the differences in our country between men and women is that if a woman is telling one of her friends about a problem, that friend will generally just really listen. But if a woman is telling a man about a problem, as soon as that man thinks of a solution, he'll interrupt her and give the solution. And if it's two men talking, and one man is explaining something and the other man has an idea of a solution and he interrupts, that doesn't bother the other man. That's kind of like we're supposed to interrupt. But
Yeah.
women really do not like being interrupted and being told what the solution is. They really just want to be heard and
Yeah.
understood, and they can then come up with their own solution. I mean, so there's in our country, there are some definite general differences between men and women. I mean, there are some exceptions, but so those are interesting to work with.
But that happens here as well. Like for me as a woman, I will want to be heard. And I know you're smart. I know you have solutions, but I just want you to keep quiet and hear me. Like, when I am coming to you, I just want to vent. And I think one thing I've learned is that when you're talking to a man about a problem and you realize that they are already contemplating a solution, like I interject and tell them like, I just want to vent. I just want to vent. I need you to listen. I don't want you to tell me what to do about
You
it.
know, and you know, let's say you're a woman and you're seeking therapy, and it's a male therapist. The therapists usually are trained not to interrupt and not to offer solutions too quickly, and um, so I don't think you should expect a male therapist to to interrupt you. But if they do, definitely say, stop, I'm not finished. You don't hear me yet. You can be confrontive. You can be kind of upfront with a therapist, but generally I don't think you would run into that much. Um, Sometimes if people have a problem that involves another person, like let's say if I'm
Mhm.
a man and I have a problem that involves a woman like my wife, I might seek a female therapist because she might be able to give me a little more insight into how to handle or deal with a problem with a woman than maybe a male therapist would. So sometimes you can pick the gender of your therapist on purpose. Usually it shouldn't matter, um, but sometimes people will actually have a preference for a male therapist or a female therapist. Or an older therapist. One time I was working with a couple and they were in their 60s and I was in my 40s. And after I'd worked with them 2 or 3 times, they called me and they said, we're not coming back because you're too young. So they just felt that I was like a generation or two younger and I just couldn't understand what their issues in their life was like. And that was fine. That was fine with me. So sometimes there are circumstances like gender or age or that you just don't feel that other person can get you, can really understand you. And that's okay. You can switch and change to a different person.
Yeah.
Keep in mind,
I actually,
as the customer, you have power. You don't have to do everything that therapist tells you. If you aren't comfortable, you don't even have to go back to that person. You have a lot of power as a consumer.
yeah. I never thought about it that way. Like I can choose which gender I'd like to talk to. Like for example, if I am trying to understand my dad, I can choose to choose a therapist who is male of a certain age.
Hmm, hmm. You might try it. I mean, generally therapists are trained to be adaptable, but
Yeah,
yeah, sometimes that might help. Um,
yeah. I
let me.
think as we're winding up, I had some questions about what what it's called cognitive behavioral analysis and like I would like you to explain to us what that is.
Yes, there are certain types of therapies: psychoanalysis, cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive. There are all sorts of theories and types of therapy. And usually a good therapist can use bits and pieces of all of these that fit the situation. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an approach that tries to change the way that person thinks about things in order to change their emotions. So the idea is that, for example, if I tell myself I can't stand such and such, well, just the act of telling myself that makes me more anxious when I'm in that situation that I've said that I can't stand. And so we
Mhm.
call that self-talk. So the person is talking to themselves in a way that really actually makes the problem worse. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, the therapist helps point out some of those internal narratives or messages, the statements that the person is thinking and saying that are actually getting in their way, and how to
Yeah.
change those to a different kind of statement. Like instead of saying, I can't stand this, you say to yourself, I can stand it. I don't like it, but I can stand it. So, yeah, that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is: changing the way a person thinks in order to change their actions and their feelings.
And what about transactional analysis?
Uh-huh. Transactional analysis, one of my favorites, is looking at the way two people are interacting. And the idea is that each person has part of their personality that we call the parent, and part
Mhm.
that we call the adult, and part that we call the child. And the parent part is judgmental and should, what you should and shouldn't do. The adult is problem solving, like realistic and problem solving. And the child is kind of emotional and more needy and demanding. And so let's say Evelyn and I are having a conversation, and I say to her something that I mean as an adult statement, like, maybe you should try such and such. And I'm just making a realistic suggestion. But Evelyn is in her child mode, and she yells back at me, "Stop telling me what to do." Well, then that transaction is not healthy. It's not satisfying because I'm on one level, the adult level, and the other person is on the child level. And so we call that a crossed transaction. And so we're
Mhm.
missing each other. And so in transactional analysis, usually this is with couples, the therapist helps people kind of be able to operate more on that adult level from one adult to the adult part of the other person, and not to get into the parent
Yeah.
judgmental part or the child kind of needy, threatened, vulnerable part too quickly. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorites to do with couples, and couples can really usually understand this right away, and they really can see it. They can see it happen. And if you can
Yeah.
ask the therapist, what techniques do you use? Do you use such and such cognitive behavioral therapy? And if they say they do, you can ask them, well, tell me about it. What do you mean by it? What is involved in that? How does it work? It's okay. You don't already, as the client, you're not expected to know all this stuff. So then the therapist should be able to explain it and why they use
Yeah.
it, when they use it or when they don't use it. There are 150 or more types of therapy approaches. Um,
Yeah.
and so there are three or four main ones, but just many. And so you can ask the therapist what do they like to do? What is their
Yeah.
training?
You also spoke of the dialectical behavioral therapy. What is it?
Dialectical behavior therapy is actually really a combination of tried and true good therapy techniques. Some are the cognitive techniques,
Mhm.
and it's mainly a therapy used with people who have severe, what we call personality disorders, like
Mhm.
uh, uh, borderline personality disorders, where they're vulnerable and their behavior is somewhat chaotic, and their relationships have problems, and so it affects almost every area of their life. So it's a collection of techniques that you learn one at a time. Some of it's how to relax. Some of it's how to think in a different way. And collectively, these techniques come together to help people with that issue, because it's not just one problem. It's like a collection of problems within the same person. So you have to have more of a collection of therapies for that same person.
Yeah.
And you can find these all whenever you come across a term like
Yeah.
that. You can find them on the internet, and you can read about them and what it means. Um, Most therapists don't use just one type of approach. Most therapists know about several approaches, and they use the bits and pieces of each one that are helpful and that fit the particular client's needs or situation. So we call that eclectic. You pick and choose the parts that work for your client. And that respects the person as an individual, that they're unique. They're not like everyone else. Anyway, this has been a fun discussion. And if people have any more questions, they can always email me. Um, they can send them in the questions to Evelyn through our
Yeah.
platform. And like I mentioned in the beginning,
Yeah.
if you have ideas for future programs, we're both very open to that. I think next time we're going to
Yeah.
talk about depression, but and I think maybe the time after that about the criminal mind. But we're very adaptable, and most of the things we talk about there will be an article that you can get that's on that topic if you
Yeah.
request it. So anyway,
We
Evelyn, this has
we
been a lot of fun.
yeah. We usually share the article on our description on Facebook, LinkedIn, and also on YouTube as we are sharing as we are discussing these topics, like right the day before we discuss the topics. And if you would like to see what we just discussed right now, you can go on the description down below on YouTube, and you will see everything we've just discussed. This has been an amazing session. Thank you so much, Dr. Claiborn, for sharing and
Oh,
um, yeah,
yes, my
for
pleasure.
giving us your yeah,
Anyway, we will see
yeah,
you all next time. Tell your friends. Next week, 2 weeks from today, every other Wednesday, we'll be back. And Evelyn will be on her best behavior next time. We hope.
I was good. I tend to enjoy myself a lot, and he knows about it. So he tries to use it against me, and I don't think that's fair because you're my therapist. But anyway, that's okay.
We'll try to get my dog, my dog Coco, to be on
Yeah, I know
his best
those.
behavior.
Yeah, for
Okay.
joining us, like Dr. Claiborne has been a therapist for I think 2 years now, and I think it has been great. And we have been using the Mind to Mind platform to discuss about various mental health issues. And I know we got a comment about someone talking about how technical it is, and we would like to give more information. We didn't want it to be just a conversation about problems and all that, and like a chit chat. We needed you guys to have more information about mental health issues, and that's what we're here to do. Thank you so much, Dr. Claiborne. I
Oh,
wish you a
my
lovely
pleasure.
week.
I will see you next time.
Yeah. All right. Bye bye, guys.